thanks for coming.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name is Benjamin. I am from America. I've been living in Japan for about 11 years, and I love it. The culture is great. The people are great. It's safe, which makes it very easy to do a number of very interesting things, including being a freelancer.
I see. And you are official ambassador of Cool Japan.
Yes, no, I realize it sounds a little bit amusing perhaps,
Right.
but a couple of years ago I did get an official letter from the Minister of the Cool Japan Strategy of the Japanese government proclaiming that I am an official Cool Japan ambassador is the official title.
Okay.
So I'm certified by the Cabinet Secretariat. I'm an official Cool Japan ambassador.
Great. And what else do you do?
What else do I do? Well, in terms of ambassadorship, I am also the tourism ambassador of Nakano Ward in Tokyo, the best ward in the world. I am an author. I've written a couple of books in Japanese. One of them is right here, Relearning English, Otona no Tame no Yarinaoshi Eikaiwa. And I do a good amount of translation and communications consulting.
I see. When you say communication consultant, what exactly do you do? What are the sort of unique characteristics of the communication with Japanese, right?
With Japanese people, I would actually say it's more towards Japanese clients who are interested in interfacing with the outside world.
Okay.
And a lot of it does have to do with translation. So if you have a PR pamphlet that's written in Japanese, but you want to attract an international client base, what do you do with it?
Yes.
And I say specifically, what do you do with it? Because most people would think, oh, why don't we just translate it? But I find that generally speaking, direct literal translations, actual translations aren't that effective in bridging the gap between Japan and the outside world, because the expectations tend to be so different. How the actual narrative is structured is different.
Right.
How the examples are laid out is different. What will appeal to people is different. It'll eventually involve translation of certain things like facts and settings and important people. But how that information is presented and what is highlighted generally tends to be entirely different. So rendering an opinion on that is where the consulting part comes in.
Right. I see. Okay. What do you find? I mean, in terms of the communication in Japan and whether that can be translated, quote unquote, you know, in the real sense of the term.
Sure.
How do you find the communication style in here? Is it
In Japan,
Yes.
well, in
whether
terms
among
of
Japanese or Japanese interfacing with the other non-Japanese?
personally, I like the communication structure with Japanese to Japanese, precisely because of what makes it so different from the outside world, which is that it's highly contextual. So when you are talking within an entirely Japanese context with people who are used to their own roles, who know what's going to be said, who are generally very familiar with the format, you don't really need to do all that much communicating at all. There aren't that many surprises. Everyone really knows what's going on, and it's comfortable and it's stable and it's safe. And it's one of the main things that's had me living in this country for so long. It's predictable in a good way, in a way that makes you feel like you're being taken care of, which I think is wonderful. The challenge is that when you bring something into this communications structure that is foreign, international, that is outside of this usual context, you tend to get surprises because the communication is so contextualized usually, it's very difficult to unpack that. People aren't used to unpacking it because they're used to just being in this little circle. But if you're dealing with someone new, all of a sudden you have to explain everything. All of a sudden you have to introduce your company because maybe they really haven't heard of it. All of a sudden you have to be paying real close attention to your PowerPoint slides because they haven't heard all of this stuff before, and it is new to them. And sometimes they may have questions, and maybe you've never answered those questions beforehand because all the people that you presented to up until that point don't need to ask them. So dealing with the unknown and anticipating the unknown and making sure that you're very clear so that you can clear up the unknown tend to be the big challenges when Japanese people move from domestic-facing communication to international-facing communication. It's not particularly difficult. It's not that hard, I think, to master. But the one fundamental thing that is so necessary to realize is that it is different. You are dealing with people who are not used to the way that you're doing things. And so because of that, you have to let go of what you're used to. Which is, I think, a skill that any one of us should develop.
I see. What about, even within Japan, I hear sometimes the generation gap is quite big. Do you find that in terms of the communication? I mean, probably the older generation sort of live in this context that everybody understands. But the younger generation live in a different context.
Oh,
so
sure.
to speak.
Oh, sure.
So when they try to sort of communicate intergenerationally, even in Japan, they may have some trouble.
Oh, sure. I mean, you see the same thing in my own home country of America. I mean, the generation gap exists everywhere. I think I remember my uncle once pointing out something very interesting to me, that in as much as there's differences between Americans and Japanese, if I was to consider the differences between me and another, say, 30-something in Japan, and then between me and my own grandfather, there's a lot more differences between me and my own grandfather than there would be with a Japanese person. So I think it's exactly right what you're saying, particularly in a country with Japan where the elderly are so numerous and have a significant amount of political power, both in terms of the government and in terms of organizations. In terms of how to bridge that domestic gap, which I think might have been the question you were leading to, I mean, this is certainly something that's not within my usual skill set. But I would say a general being more open to the unknown, being more open to almost trying to explain what you do to yourself, as if you were taking a fresh look at what you were doing and say, if I were just starting at what I do every day for a job and have been doing for years, if I were just starting it right now, what would I need to know to do what I do? And that this sort of drill is saying, oh, well, I do this every day, but how would I put this into words? How would I make sure that if someone was taking over my job, they would know what I was doing? Working on those sorts of basic communication skills, I think, works in almost any human interaction. You mentioned the generation gap. One thing that I really enjoy doing in Japan, which I think I can't do as much in America, is moving from different kind of like societal spheres to societal spheres. So I spend time working with corporate clients, but I also spend time in hobbies. I do martial arts. I go to Japanese temples a lot. And I meet a lot of people who have spent a long time in their own individual worlds and don't leave all that much, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's, if you've been running, say, like a martial arts dojo for 40 years, that's really cool. And that's probably why you've become a master. But when you're in one world for so long, sometimes you lose familiarity with how other organizations work. So I see these sorts of communication difficulties everywhere in this society. I don't think it's necessarily specific to Japan. This is just the country that I live in. So the dojo that I went to, the dojo that I still go to in Tokyo, occasionally wants to get more members, do more outreach. Have more people interested in what they're doing, and they find it quite difficult because they're so used to people coming to them who are already familiar with it. They don't know that much about advertising, they don't know much about web communications, messaging. I think at one demonstration that we had, I tried to bring up the idea of putting up a sign outside saying, like, Kengaku Muryo, you can come in and watch. And there was a lot of resistance to it. Not because they thought it was a bad idea, but because they didn't understand what the point of it was.
I see. That's very interesting.
So, again, kind of like taking a fresh look at what you're doing and saying, if I were talking to someone who was the same as me, but just didn't know anything about it, how would I explain it? I think is a very useful step towards reaching communication.
Right. Okay. Tell us a little bit about your book.
I'm so glad that you asked. So my book, published by Shogakukan in 2016, Otana no Tame no Yarinaoshi Eikaiwa, was the result of an editor pitching me on a book about teaching English. And I've done a number of things in Japan. You know, I've translated, I studied martial arts full time, I was an academic for a while, but I never taught English. So initially I was like, well, I don't really know if I could write a book about teaching English because I'm not exactly an expert on this sort of thing. But I had done a lot of English related work through my translations, through my consulting. So he was like, well, what advice would you have for people? And my general advice for Japanese people who have been studying Japanese in school at least 6 years, almost everyone at this point.
You mean English?
English, yeah. Is to stop studying.
Right.
Is to not study
Yeah,
anymore
yes.
because they have, and to start actually using the language. Not for the sake of using it, but to use it to do whatever they wanted to do when they started studying. I think that anyone who studies anything and learns something from it isn't learning it necessarily because they're good at studying or because they like academics. It's because they want to be able to do something. So the numerous, like the hordes of people in Japan who are all saying, well, I wish I knew better English. Oh, I wish I could speak you know, English conversation. I don't think it's that they love English so much as they want to talk with people who aren't Japanese, or read foreign magazines in topics that they're interested in, or watch movies that don't have subtitles on them. So what I encourage people to do in the book is to do exactly that. To realize what they want to be able to do by studying English, and then do it, and to use that target of their own interest as their own curriculum. So I say if you're interested in like watching American TV shows, watch American TV shows. Not necessarily just start watching them and watching them and watching them. Well, that's not a bad idea. But use a service like Netflix, use a service like Hulu that will have English subtitles on them. Not Japanese subtitles, but English ones. So that if you miss a word, you can stop it and say, oh, I saw that word. But something that you enjoy, something that you really want to do, I think is integral to learning anything.
Right.
And unless you know what appeals to you, even someone who's written a whole book on this subject won't be able to help, because I only know what I'm interested in. I don't know what you're interested in. But I assume that you are a very passionate person who is very committed to pursuing her own interests, seeing as we're conducting this interview in fluent English.
I see. Very good. Okay.